All right, so continuing on, now that we've finished up Unit 5, we're heading on into Unit 6, which is Consequences of Industrialization. So, what does that really mean? So, this is yet again set in that 1750 to 1900 span. So, what we're looking at now is, we talked about the Industrial Revolution in our previous unit and its impact on societies, particularly what's happening in like Europe as a focus. Now, we're going to see how. Really, this unit focuses on how Europe and the Americas will start to look to conquer other areas. So now that you saw independence in like for example, formerly the Americas have been colonized, right? Like North and South America. And now that we saw those revolutionary movements that got their independence, Latin American Revolution, Haitian Revolution. So now Europeans and other new players in this colonization game are looking to where they're going to colonize next. And that is where we're looking at now imperialism in Asia and in Africa. And so that's really going to be the focus of this unit. How industrialization led to this imperialism and how do people respond. So, that being said, let's look at the first part regarding it. So, chapter 18 is really going to focus on imperialism itself. So, we've talked about Europeans creating colonies before. So let's kind of recap. Remember, as I said, the Americas have gotten their independence. They had previously discovered that new world. And so now they're looking at in the after those revolutionary movements and the colonies are ending in the Americas. Now they're looking at Africa and Asia. So what do colonies provide? Colonies provide cheap raw materials and foodstuffs because we said in industrialization they're not working on or producing raw materials. They want those raw materials to make finished manufactured goods from. So particularly very important things for this time frame will be rubber, palm oil, copper, diamonds, and other general just basic foodstuffs. So we'll deal with this a lot more as we get into the basics of this. Palm oil is going to provide like the lubrication for the machines in the factories so they don't like break down, rust, etc. Copper is going to be very important because of the onset of electricity and being utilized for wiring. Rubber, as you see the onset of more the automobile industry and rubber being utilized for like tires and things like that. And then also diamonds, just because diamonds are always been considered, something very wealth and status associated, very valuable gem. And there are huge deposits of diamonds in especially Africa. All right, so why are these colonies important? Because they also are going to become markets for European goods. And they oftentimes are going to be fueled by investments from Europeans, whether that be individuals or even whole nation states, which we'll talk about. And so, further on, imperialism, Europeans conquering these areas, is going to be driven by nationalism and competition. So, we talked about nationalism previously, the idea of being tied together because of a common heritage, culture, language, etc. So, for example, in this time frame, now that we've said Germany and Italy have, unified into their own specific countries, now Germany and Italy want to get into the imperial game as well. And so that nationalism drives the desire for colonies, and then competition between European countries oftentimes leads to that. And it's not just Europe now. You've got other players in the game, the United States, particularly in Asia, or Japan, or Russia. So we'll be dealing with those nation states as well, creating colonies now. So this map of Africa kind of showcases how Africa is divided up from a colonization standpoint. It looks really complicated and convoluted. It's in your textbook, and it's a pretty good resource just to kind of give you a big picture of who's conquering where in Africa. And I'll get more into that later on as we go. All right, why is it so relative, not necessarily easy, but how are Europeans able to take over large swaths of Africa and Asia? And it's not just Europeans, let's say the Western world. And that's because of technological advantage first. All right. So the utilization of repeating rifles. So one of the most common weapons that basically wins these wars for Europeans is what's called the Maxim gun. The Maxim gun, as you can see here, is more or less a turret kind of style machine gun. And so when those rifles can fire 2 to 3 times or even, dozens of times faster than other older antiquated weapons that other people have, it gives them a significant advantage. There's even an old kind of like saying that the Europeans have, we'll talk about in class with this. They also have telegraphs for communication, which helps to coordinate movements, get information around in areas. Steamship power and eventually steam power for railroads will help in terms of travel, transportation, troop movements, all those things, right? We also referenced during Columbian Exchange the discovery of quinine as a treatment for malaria is going to be really important because up to this point, if Europeans or basically, non-Africans went farther into the African continent, then most likely we're going to catch malaria and die. And so being able to use quinine to treat malaria means that Europeans and other non-African groups could get further into more tropical regions of Africa. What the Europeans are going to do, what the Western world typically views this as, is that their technological superiority means that they are superior as a whole race as well. And so this is that jacked up mindset that we see in this time frame regarding really racial ideology coming into play here, which had been utilized in the past in various areas of the world we've talked about, but this really takes it to a whole nother level in this time frame. One of those ideas is based upon what's called social Darwinism. So we talked about, or we've referenced before, Darwin's evolution of the species and survival of the fittest. Well, social Darwinism applies that to mankind, to humans, and saying that this is why some races are considered higher than others. And remember, there's nothing really genetically different between the basic makeup of humans. The question about race is something that's more, most historians will tell you, is more of like a social idea than more based in biology. But that's for, more debates and other topics. But those are just things to keep in mind as we talk about this. We'll look at various political cartoons that deal more with the aspects of civilizing these areas. And that's what the Western world thinks they're going to do for parts of Africa and Asia. And so we'll delve further into that as we go. All right, that's the beginning of your Chapter 18 notes, Part 1. We'll continue on. Thanks for watching. All right, continuing on in Chapter 18, Part 2, looking at European/Western imperialism. Let's look at the second wave of conquests in Asia and Africa. So, like I said, that first wave of European colonization and imperialism, that was in the Americas, right, with the discovery of North and South America. Then what's going to happen is once Europe starts to industrialize, has access to all these new different resources from the Americas and industrializes, gets those new technologies, then they're able to conquer more areas and influence more territories in Africa and Asia. However, it's not the same who's who in terms of European countries or Western countries oriented here, or oriented in this imperialism side of things. It's a few have dropped off, so to speak, and some have joined the fray. So I think when we look at our previous time frame of that 1450 to 1750 of colonization of the Americas, we talked about like Spain and Portugal as being some of the earliest and best in terms of encapsulating that period. Well, Spain and Portugal have drastically declined in terms of power and influence in Europe at this time. So instead, now you're going to see the newly formed nations of Germany and Italy in Europe, and also Belgium from a European standpoint, become really involved in conquering areas in Asia and Africa. Also, the United States is now taking on its imperialist stance as well. In the late 1800s, the United States joins the fray here, and also Japan. Japan starts to assert its power, especially as China has weakened in the realm of East Asia. And so Japan actually westernizes, industrializes, and starts to conquer a lot of territories in parts of Asia. We still are also going to see the East India companies, EIC here, that references the British, Dutch East India companies. Those still have significant influence in Southeast Asia. The British taking over a huge swath of India at this point. Now, remember, up to this point, the Mughal Empire was still around in India. It was one of the reasons why the British East India Company couldn't just outright take it all over, because the Mughals were strong enough to, be a force of resistance against the British, or just actually make the British, nervous of trying to conquer all this territory. As the Mughals are declining, the British are taking over more and more. And so the British East India Company there is starting to have a lot of influence in India. And we'll delve a lot more into that throughout this chapter. And also the Dutch in Indonesia, these Spice Islands that we referenced before, they're still taking over, gradually acquiring these areas. It's not like they just, dominate an entire subcontinent, within a year or two. It takes time. And they slowly make alliances, slowly get people to both help them and also make enemies and have to then defeat said enemies. Probably the biggest flashpoint I could say of this period is what's called the scramble for Africa. And in the last 25 years of that 1800s time frame of the 19th century, you see Germany and Italy really start to want to assert their influence in Africa as well. And British and French, all these different forces are vying for control over this area. And so, in what might be one of the most insensitive conferences in world history, and insensitive is probably one of the nicer words to say, you have what's called the Berlin Conference of 1884, where the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, calls together European leaders at the time. And I kid you not, at this conference, over the time frame of their meetings, they basically put a map of Africa out there and everyone just calls dibs on chunks of it. I mean, they basically just carve up the continent of Africa among Europeans. No African nations are inviting this. There's not a single African person there to say that might not be a good idea when you're putting together two tribes or three tribes that have not coexisted peacefully for hundreds or potentially thousands of years, right? But the Europeans are like, yeah, that's fine. This river to this river, that's good for the British to own. So that's going to have drastic consequences for the next 150 years, realistically, or 100-ish years of world history. So we'll deal with a lot more of that as we look further into imperialism and how we look at decolonization when African nations get their independence post-World War II. So yeah, scramble for Africa. It's basically, all these European nations vying for control over Africa. And that Berlin Conference is just the moment where they finally carve out a lot of these sections in a most egregious way. So not all of these colonies are going to be heavily settled. So we saw the British, when they colonized the Americas, it was like a settler colony where a lot of British came over and lived, started families, all that. That happens in other areas for the British as well, in Australia, in New Zealand, and in South Africa. And as we get further along, we'll look into more specific examples there. What other ways are Western nations expanding? So the United States is expanding west. Those of you U.S. history savvy students are familiar with the idea of the United States manifests destiny, and once by the late 1800s, by the 1880s, the United States pretty much won the West, so to speak. Has tackled all the last remaining Native American resistance groups, and now kind of from sea to shining sea, coast to coast, have control over the United States. So now the United States post-westward expansion, then they start to think after the Spanish-American War about getting into this imperialistic game as well. If you think Teddy Roosevelt, you're right under this time frame. I think we've referenced Panama Canal before, and we'll do again. So that just kind of encapsulates the United States and their imperialist expansionist policies at this time frame. The Japanese, as we said, are going to colonize areas like Taiwan or Korea. So the Korean Peninsula right there, that's traditionally been either associated with China or maybe even a tributary state of China on the mainland itself. And then the island nation of Taiwan, also known as Formosa, which traditionally had been under Chinese rule, at least for the last several hundred years. Japanese are going to take that over and start to assert their influence in East Asia. Now, we can't say that all of these peoples, these areas in Africa and Asia are taken over. And we'll note two specific examples that can be very helpful for you. The first will be the area called Ethiopia. And there is a modern-day nation of Ethiopia in East Africa. Now, we last referenced Ethiopia when we talked about its integration of Christianity, right? We talked about the nation called Axum that, because of its ties to Rome, and this was 1,000 years ago, right? Back when the Romans were still around in the early hundreds CE and whatnot. You've got Christianity, having an influence in Ethiopia, and it's pretty much been the most Christian area in Africa. Africa would pretty much, in terms of North and West Africa, have some Muslim influence, and then more local associated religions in smaller areas. So Ethiopia has been that Christian area, and Italy actually calls, in that Berlin conference, we talk about how that they, the European nations are looking for specific areas that they're going to conquer and have divvied it up. The Italians are going to try to take over Ethiopia. And a pretty interesting turning point in East African history here is what's called the Battle of Adwa in 1896, where a Ethiopian force actively defeats a Italian force. And so this is one of the first times you truly see a nation in Africa maintain its independence by holding off European conquest in this time frame. So that's a pretty noteworthy event. This is a very famous image as a result of this. We'll take some time to analyze that a little bit more. Ethiopia also is a Christian nation. We can talk about its significance there as well, because they would be fighting against other Christian Europeans. So also, you could also talk about Siam, which is basically known as like Thailand in Southeast Asia. They're going to westernize in ways as well, and they're going to use diplomacy instead of fighting in conflict as a way to hold off European or Western encroachment into their territory as well. So 2 examples of how, whether via diplomacy or via conflict, some areas maintain their independence. Okay, so that's looking at kind of big picture of these conquests. Now we're really going to start delving further into specific examples of where areas are being conquered and what are the repercussions of that. And we'll keep going on part 3. Thanks for watching. All right, so let's continue on in chapter 18, part 3, and look at examples of European rule in Africa and in Asia. So when we talk about Europeans having to take control of these areas, it's very difficult for them to literally have the manpower to constantly be in control of everything. And so what they're going to have to utilize is locals to help maintain control over areas. And so they're going to pay locals for service, for their work, and also to keep them loyal to the British, the French, whoever. They'll employ them to be soldiers, clerks, clerks like in the administrative offices, or rulers. And they'll pay off like local rulers, tribal leaders, or things like that, to have them be loyal to the British or French or whoever's in control, the Dutch. And then it makes it easier to take control over a region because like the local leaders are backing the Westerners. They will also actually provide education to some as well. Now, one of the things was that the Europeans, the Western world, was going to provide education to these uncivilized groups. So what they do is that they do give education to a small group of elite people that are going to provide service typically for them. So, a clerk might be taught English or French, how to read and write, the math, arithmetic necessary to work in their administrative offices in these outposts. So they're kind of teaching them what they need for their services, not necessarily like holistically how to do everything for themselves. And that's going to be one of the criticisms of colonization at this time frame. There are a few of the elite few that are already being educated that get even higher levels of education, become doctors, lawyers, things like that. And so what also happens is that you have the group that works with the Europeans as either, paid off or, loyal in whatever shape or form, and they become resented by their fellow tribesmen or clansmen, or, their fellow Africans or Asians, because essentially they are working with what becomes the enemy in the Western sense. So there's a lot of frustration there as a result. One of the best examples that we can give of a rebellion in this time frame is what's called the Sepoy Rebellion, or the Sepoy Mutiny. This starts in India, and the video here is a really nice overview. It takes a few minutes. I would heavily suggest checking that out. But essentially, in India at this time, the British, through the British East India Company, have slowly gotten footholds in India. Now, they've done this through more alliances than military acquisitions. Remember, the Mughals are still in charge of India at this time, and they're strong enough that the British don't feel confident just outright destroying them, especially early on. The Mughals, as you remember, are a Muslim-based empire. the majority of the population in India is Hindu. And so that's going to have some huge implications here because the British are hiring these soldiers, these Indian soldiers they'll call sepoys, to be mercenaries, so to speak, for them. What happens is that there's a huge uprising that starts here as a result of bullets. Now, there's other frustrations from British rule, but the bullets are kind of the flashpoint. What does that mean? So the bullets are greased with cow and pig fat. And that's significant because cows are sacred to Hindus and pigs are considered unclean to Muslims. So the Hindu and Muslim soldiers under British rule that are being employed are now forced to contradict their religion. And so that becomes this huge frustration point. And eventually these sepoys rebel. They get the last Mughal emperor to back them. The British have to get British soldiers. The British East India Company has to get British soldiers from other parts of the British Empire to come help them. The British also have to get Sikhs. If you remember, Sikhs in India were a blend between Hindus and Muslims. They had to get their help. And eventually, though, they do put down this rebellion. The Mughals are basically ousted. And now, because of the British Empire having to bail out the British East India Company with all this extra help, India now becomes under the government's control, the crown's control, not this British East India Company, this capitalist group. Okay? So big implications there, things you need to keep in mind. All right, continuing on. So we've talked about social Darwinism and its impact on how Europeans consider themselves superior to Africans and Asians and basically non-Westerners in this time frame. So one of the things you're going to see is that continues on into the scientific racism aspect where they're going to apply scientific principles to justify superiority. They're measuring scalps and brain sizes and all sorts of different ways to justify superiority over others. What it really leads to is a lot more barriers between European and native groups here. And you're also going to see a large reduction in interracial unions than in the first wave. What do I mean by first wave? The first wave of Europeans conquering is the Americas, right? 1492, Columbus, Ocean Blue. So when the Americas are conquered by the Europeans, think the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, there was a lot of intermarriage between them and the natives, right? The Native Americans of varying groups, right? Here, there's significantly much less of that. And part of that is because of this new pervading sense of racism. Now, the number of settlers in an area is going to vary. And one of the largest settler colonies that we'll talk about as a really good example will be South Africa. In South Africa, they already have a pretty big white population because of Dutch settlers that got there much earlier in that exploration phase. The British will eventually take control of that, and we'll deal with that a lot more later on in this chapter. But basically what comes about in Africa is this large segregation style system of racially separating the British and the Africans and even Afrikaners. We'll deal with that a little bit more. But basically, if you're familiar with United States history and the segregation in the South, many of those aspects are similar. So if you're thinking that, you're on the right track in terms of the racial separation associated with that. Some people make the argument that the South African apartheid is even more egregious. It definitely lasts longer, we can say. I want to say it's like 1990 it exists up to. And you may be familiar with South Africa and this system of racial separation that's called apartheid. You may be familiar with this, though, by understanding the work of Nelson Mandela, who was a pivotal leader in helping South Africa to end apartheid. And yet again, we'll deal with him a lot more later. One of the other things we can talk about in this time frame is that there is a huge difference in how previous empires, especially looking big picture world history, didn't tend to impact people's daily lives. Now in this wave, it most certainly does, especially when we use examples like the Belgian Congo that we'll get into. Those will really help you understand what I mean by the strong impact on daily life. All right, finally for part 3, we need to look at how Europeans are going to adapt adapt their style of rule to the colonized people. So they're going to use the way that society is also structured in their thought process and how they organize their rule. So they like India in that it's very traditional based on this caste system. If you remember, the caste system is one of the basic tenets of the Hindu faith, and the caste system is a very well-organized social structure for people to stay in their role. And so the British value that because they will adapt something like that for them and help put that in place. So then it further means that there is a rule structure of who's lowest to highest in society. They'll also then take the idea of Africa from this tribal sense and utilize chiefs as local rulers to look after various tribes. And we talked earlier about how they would employ them, try to maintain their loyalty by paying them. Now, there's also a lot of contradictions with this. Okay, not all Europeans think that this is acceptable. There are many that, especially as time goes on, start to realize that the promises that were intended are not what's actually happening on the ground for the locals in Africa and Asia, for the natives there. So let's look at two of those contradictions. One is that in Europe, there's been this new push of enlightenment and democracy, and we saw these revolutions like in France and elsewhere pushing for democratic principles. And a lot of those governments are starting to reflect that in Europe. And that sounds great, but then you go to the empires out into these colonies, and it's not very democratic at all. And so people are starting to question, wait a minute, I thought that's what our country stands for, our nation stands for. Why is it so different in these colonial areas? Another contradiction that people we'll talk about in this time frame is that one of the ways that the Europeans basically push back against the idea of modernizing these colonies is that they'll justify not providing as much education and support, basically, in terms of building these colonies into industrialize and things like that, is they'll say that by modernizing those colonies, they would destabilize them because they would upend the social structure, the way that their lives had been, and so that they're helping them as they can. So it's a weird kind of contradiction justifying staying in control, because if they were to modernize and modernize too quickly, it destabilized these nations in Africa and Asia, and they would have no shot. They would just implode upon themselves. All right, so that's Chapter 18 Notes, Part 3. We'll continue on. Thanks for watching. Okay, continuing on in Chapter 18, looking at Part 4. So what we're going to do is look at some more specific examples of how imperialism actually happened. And in order to do that, we first need to go back to the map for a minute and make sure we're all on the same page. So going back to this map of Africa, first off, let's take a look and see who are your players, so to speak, in terms of Europe and Africa. Particularly, we note that if you look at this map, the French and the British tend to have the most territory. Keep in mind the French are controlling West Africa, which is like a lot of that has the Sahara Desert. So a lot of this territory is relatively underdeveloped in that sense. The British in control of Egypt is going to be very important. That's Suez Canal. The British also control parts of what's called the Gold Coast here, and then South Africa, as we've referenced previously. So the British and the French really own the most territory. You do have some independent states, like we talked about Ethiopia, fighting off the Italians, and Liberia, which has ties to America. There are new European countries that are in the imperialism mindset. We talked about Germany. Germany acquires territories in East Africa and Southwest Africa here, and in kind of Central Africa, what's called Cameroon. Italy has a few territories here, East Coast, in Libya / Tripoli area. Portuguese and Spanish do have some colonies, but not a lot, because if you remember, it's interesting, is in the first wave of colonization, the Spanish and the Portuguese are the ones that really, especially the Portuguese, are navigating across the African continent first on the coast. And it's just kind of interesting now, we talked about the decline and fall, the Spanish definitely, and the Portuguese as well, and these new empires that are on the rise, like the British and the French. And then finally, there's also a new Belgian Congo colony, which we'll talk a lot more with as well. There in Central Africa. All right, so that being said, let's get to it. So first off, in various ways across all these colonies, the locals are going to be forced to do unpaid work. Now, depending on what colony you're in at that time, what area, who are the overseers of that, it's going to vary how much you have to do. But in general, you need to understand that periodically locals were forced in both Africa and in Asia to do work for the nation state. The British, the French, or whoever say it's for the good of the colony, for the good of the empire. So therefore, they should want to participate in this. Now, some of this labor is not necessarily as egregious as what we've seen from a world history sense. And then there are also god-awful examples that we'll talk about here. Probably the most infamous one of this time frame is what happened in the Belgian Congo. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So King Leopold II of Belgium actually personally owns this colony. It's not a product not a holding of the state itself. He personally owns it. And so he directs and moves everything that's associated in this colony. The businesses that make money from there, the soldiers that are there to keep order are all loyal to him and paid by him essentially because it's his money. And he is going to make millions of dollars exploiting this area. What are they doing in the Belgian Congo? So they are forcing the locals to go out to collect ivory and rubber. Rubber, we talked about particularly, was noteworthy because of its importance with tires, like for bicycles or cars. And so what starts to happen is that the brutal treatment of the Congolese gets out because what Leopold's basically shock troops do is that they make these people go and find ivory and rubber. If they don't meet their quotas or unquote working hard enough, they will mutilate, cutting off their hands, and even putting some to death that aren't working hard. So they're instilling these fear tactics, and images like what you see pictured here in the bottom left are when they finally get out of what's happening in areas like the Congo, really put a bad taste in everyone's mouth in Europe. And that's one of the reasons why you're going to see the lead eventually in the early 1900s of decolonization, which we'll talk about. Now, once these atrocities come out in the Belgian Congo, King Leopold loses control of the colony. It's directly in charge by the Belgian government takes control of it. And Leopold, of course, will become notorious in history for his role here in exploitation. Really, really terrible example of how bad colonization was in areas. So that's Africa. Let's also look at what's happening maybe in Southeast Asia and Java. So we referenced that the Dutch are in control there. And what starts to happen in Southeast Asia is that the Dutch are forcing the locals there to take of their farmland, 20% of it has to be grown as a cash crop. And they have to in turn give that to the Dutch as basically a tax. So basically, these people are losing a fifth of their available land to farm and then just having to turn that over to the Dutch when they could have made money from that cash crop. What does that result in this area? More famine, less food being grown. People have less money to pay for that food. And also less money to keep their land. So there's a lot of debt. People have to borrow a lot of money for this. And so this just kind of really showcases another example of the negative implications of imperialism. Finally, we can talk East Africa. Think the German colonies in East Africa that I just showed you. They're going to force cotton cultivation there, which previously hadn't really happened as much, particularly because up to this point, if you needed cotton, you got it from India or maybe Egypt. But now the British rule both of those. And so the Germans then have their colony kind of focus on that production. Also, before we get farther, I realized I did not hit the Asia map that I wanted to talk about. So give me just a second as I do that. Now, as you look at Asia a little bit as well, India and this Burma / parts of South and Southeast Asia are controlled by the British, as we talked about before. Here are the Dutch in the East Indies, Indonesia that we've talked about. The United States now in control of the Philippines. China will deal with a lot more later in the next chapter. Japan, we said, was also starting to conquer even areas like Korea and Formosa. And then you also see this here, this colony of the French called Indochina. That you will know of as Vietnam. And that will have some major implications later. Okay, back to it. So let's continue on and start looking at how cash crop agriculture is utilized in this time frame. So basically, as the Europeans are taking these areas over, if there is cash crop agriculture that's already there, they're going to support and help ramp that up further. Because remember, they want raw goods, raw materials from these colonies so that they can then turn them into products. So if they're already going to cash crop, fantastic. They'll just continue on and support that. Example I can give you here is going to be Burma. What happens in Burma is that the British support an increase in rice production. Now, we already know Southeast Asia is being pretty good in rice production thanks to, in earlier times, we talked about the integration of champa rice and helping that helping the Chinese population grow so much in that Sui Tang Song era of Chinese dynasties. And so basically the British help increase rice production. And this might be an example of, the positive aspects of imperialism, because it did actually help raise the standard of living for a lot of people in Burma. So we can't always say imperialism is negative. There's definitely a lot of negatives associated with it, but remember, history is complex. Also, we need to talk about cacao production in West Africa. So in modern day Ghana is what we're talking about. And so they're actually growing the cacao bean, which will be utilized for chocolate. And remember, cacao bean comes from South America. So this is a byproduct of Columbian exchange. Right now they're growing cacao beans in Africa, and that originated in the Americas. Anyway, so over time, labor shortage develops due to a variety of different reasons. And so what happens is that you have a bunch of migrant workers that have to come in from other parts of Africa. It might be east or south. And then you basically got a whole group of Africans that previously hadn't interacted with each other, or if they had, may have been negatively. Remember, Africans don't consider themselves African at this point. It's more of a local base to tie, whether it's their local family, community, tribe, whatever. And so when you pull people already living in West Africa, and then you pull other groups from East or South Africa migrating for work, there's going to be ethnic conflicts that come about. And so this is the problems that we see going back to the Berlin Conference, when the Europeans don't think about how putting different groups together and not letting them have a lot of say regarding that can lead to problems. And those will be big ones. We'll deal with them more. So then let's talk a little bit more about migration. Okay, so you have internal migrations to plantations, to mines, or to cities that are growing in Africa at this time. Those migrations, like we said, are going across the continent itself. Oftentimes, you're going to see low wages for those workers, and the management themselves pretty brutal. So while they are going for this job, that doesn't mean that the jobs are great. Not only are there internal migrations across continents, but there are also international migrations. Over 50 million Indian, Chinese, and Japanese immigrants will spread out across the globe. All right. And China, they're particularly heading to the Americas, maybe. For those of you good with U.S. history, think gold rush and the railroad boom at that time frame as the Americans are pushing out west. And they'll do a lot of work on those railroads. Also into Southeast Asia as well. Indians might be heading to Africa, maybe the British South African colony, or Egypt where the British rule, other parts of Southeast Asia, or even the Caribbean to help provide that labor of indentured servitude. So we've talked about this before, that you see in the abolition of slavery in this time frame. And so they have to see, the Europeans need some kind of labor force. And so they'll pay Chinese and Indian immigrants a very low wage to do the work instead of, enacting slavery again. Or also these concept of indentured servitude, like we've talked about before. They were given a certain amount of contract of years to work, and then were given their freedom after they had, they weren't enslaved, but they were given their free reign, so to speak, to leave. Their contract was up, and then they might have had passage to a different area of the world as a result of that. All right, there are also, let's look at what's happening in South Africa with the natives and the settler colonies there. So a very interesting aspect here in South Africa, because the Dutch had been in South Africa for a long time, and for several generations had taken over areas of South Africa. Well, because of the Napoleonic Wars and some other aspects of conflict, the British get control of South Africa from the Dutch. And so then this conflict starts to develop between the new British settlers and the Dutch people who had lived there for a couple generations now. So in South Africa, you're actually going to see a series of conflicts called the Boer Wars. And that's where you've got the Dutch that are called Afrikaners at this point versus the new British settlers. All right. And through some pretty rough fighting over the span on and off, realistically, for about that 2-decade time frame, the Dutch Afrikaners are fighting the British settlers. And then you've got the South Africans who are just in between all this. And some are loyal to some of the Dutch, some are loyal to the British, depending on allegiances. So long story short, Britain wins, the British settlers win, and so then the Africans and the Dutch Afrikaners are given specific areas of land that they can then stay on. And some people would call them concentration camps. The conditions in these reservations and some of the camps that especially the Africans are put in are really, really rough. And a lot of the Africans, especially South Africans, are sent to work in farms or in the mines of South Africa. Because in that South Africa, Rhodesia area, there's a lot of diamond mines. Think Cecil Rhodes and you'll be on the right track. Cecil Rhodes was known for trying to, he made a ton of money through the harvesting of diamonds in the lower reaches of Southern Africa. All right, finally, let's talk women and the colonial economy. And so over time, gender roles adapt. Remember, we already see gender roles changed in Africa because of the lack of men, because of the slave trade in the previous wave, how that because of the slave trade, they had pulled so many men out of these societies that, you saw more polygamy as a result of this. You saw women grow in social status and political power. So this continues. In areas that there are still a significant men population, the gender roles kind of shift in terms of who's growing what. So the men are focusing on the cash crops to try to maintain money and be competitive in the economy, and then women are focused on growing the food of subsistence farming. What also starts to happen is that you have migrations of these laborers that we talked about will separate families as a male or female, typically males, would head outside of their homeland to other parts of Africa for work. It means then that they're splitting up these families because the wife and children oftentimes stay behind. What that also means is that women are becoming stronger in their participation in politics and society, becoming heads of the household because their husband may have been taken on the slave trade, but that's kind of on the way out, as we've said, or have been had to migrate for work. And so it allows them to gain more independence. And we'll actually look at another example of women really taking control of areas and fighting back against European oppression. All right, so that is part 4, looking at some specific examples of colonial economies at this time frame. Thanks for watching. Okay, so let's continue on in chapter 18, looking at part 5. So we're kind of looking at how culture and identity are going to change in this colonization period in the second wave. So let's do it. First off, let's start with education. So the key thing about education in this time frame for the various colonized peoples of Africa and Asia is that we said that Europeans did offer education. Typically, the education was built around a purpose for Europeans, whether they were serving as clerks, administrators, or soldiers, things like that, right? So what education provides for those colonized peoples in the long run is opportunity, of course, within the framework of Western society. So the goal for those people that were loyal to the colonizers was to get some kind of economic opportunity or higher status associated with it. And so oftentimes education was shared in 2 different forms. The first one being through missionary work. So we said that one of the justifications for conquering areas like Africa or in Asia was the aspect of bringing Christianity from the European/Western perspective. So a lot of missionaries would head into these areas and provide some basic forms of education along with the spreading of their religion. There's also government-tied schools. Whether they might be actually set up in the colonized areas themselves, government-supported schools, or they would also, especially in the most elite of the local workers that they employed, the opportunities to head back to Europe for an education. In fact, it's Gandhi, you're probably familiar with Mahatma Gandhi, who received an education in Europe, in Britain, as an Indian nationalist. He will use that education to first fight for rights in South Africa for Indians, because we know a lot of Indians migrate to South Africa. And then he also uses that education to help push for Indian independence from Britain as well. And that's a young Gandhi pictured there. Quite the difference from what you may have seen of him in his later years in his Western style wear. So we have a lot of native elites will adopt European/Western culture, and the reason they'll do that is because they'll get more social status, more opportunity by siding with the colonizers. The goal of education that a lot of Europeans will use to justify this is that they're trying to eliminate unjust traditions. If you remember, one of the um, not necessarily prevalent, like I can't talk right now. Not one of the most common traditions, but one that was still practiced in India, and that was a very gave a negative connotation to Europeans, was the practice of sati here, the widow burning. And so a lot of the British rulers in India, the British East India Company, and eventually the British government tries to outlaw sati because they felt that it was a tradition that was unjust and too outdated in that sense, and definitely reflects a lot of patriarchal mindset. Big picture, though, there's still a glass ceiling when it comes to the colonized peoples. There's still typically only so far that they could go in the European/Western world. They're still treated not as equals. So while education does bring some opportunities, it can be a double-edged sword. All right, so let's talk about religion in this time frame. I'll slide my image over here. So you will see a lot of large-scale Christian conversions in Africa and in the Pacific. So we said that that was a goal, was to help to provide Christianity to these people in Africa, in Asia, because it felt that they were savages that needed this opportunity. So missionary work becomes a huge purpose of this. However, in a lot of the local areas, there's going to be disputes regarding the cultural practices that they actually practiced, particularly one that we could note of in Africa, female circumcision as a rite of passage for women, and also polygamy. In most of the Christian world, polygamy was considered an outdated practice as well. So, and like we said, one of the reasons why you saw more polygamy in Africa was because, well, literally they had taken so many men out of Africa in the slave trade. So kind of interesting how that comes back full circle. In India itself, you're going to see a rise of a more traditional Orthodox Hinduism. And one of the reasons associated with that is because they want to, the British provide the opposite in terms of Christianity and structure and format to what Hinduism already had. Now, we said that oftentimes the colonizers will use like the Hindu social structure that was already there to kind of help keep people in their place. But what basically a lot of Hindus there is they want to really try to codify more of what their religion actually is, what the clear, concrete practices of their faith are. And a lot of that is done in response because they're having to form together more as Hindus instead of doing it more locally as they had done previously before the British get involved. Now, they're also one of the big issues that starts to happen after the Sepoy Rebellion, after the Mughals are gone and the British are basically in control of India outright, is that the British are going to start to treat Muslims and Hindus differently. There's still a significant enough Muslim presence in India. And so what happens is that this starts to make those groups see their distinctions in that the Muslim community in India is treated differently and starts to become more persecuted at times. And there's conflicts, back and forth between both of them. And so what that really is going to lead to is big problems once India is trying to get its independence in the 1950s. And I'm telling you this now, but we'll get into it a lot more later. When India gets its independence, they create two actual states, the nation of India that you know today, and that's where if you were Hindu, you should be living there. And then if you were Muslim, you should be living in Pakistan on their northwest border. A lot of issues between India and Pakistan, from building back to how Europeans treated them, coming back to the Mughals. So you're kind of seeing how history builds to modern day. So because of the British, the divide between Hindu and Muslim grows even more than it already had under Mughal. All right, finally, the way that African identity changed in this time frame. So one of the things that was a byproduct of European imperialism in Africa was the rise of an African identity because of colonialism, right? So what we see this movement called Pan-Africanism that starts in this mid to late 1800s time frame. And what it starts to realize is the idea that if you are African or of African descent, you belong to this Pan-African identity. So the idea being just like, we saw nationalism from European nation states like Germany and Italy and the rise of that during that revolutions era that we referenced in our last unit, we start to see the idea of what does it truly mean to be from Africa and try to get away from, the idea of this more local community and tribal based ideas that we've seen. And, what does it mean to be African or be of African descent? And so while there's still a big push for this post colonization, it's still a huge issue for Europeans to really let go and allow Africa to develop, because Africa for the last 150 years has basically been part of a colonized world. So it's an interesting development that you're going to see, and something that we'll continue to talk about in the next 100 years when we cover that 1900 to modern day-esque time frame. So it's because of Europeans taking over Africa and kind of like telling Africans, hey, well, you're all under British rule here in this colony or this state. It makes them start to realize what they do and do not in terms of Africans have in common. So this is a movement that we're going to talk about more as well. And there we have it. That is your part 5 notes. We'll continue on with part 6 and close up shop next. Thanks for watching. Okay, so let's finish up chapter 18, part 6, looking at indigenous responses to state expansion, basically colonization that we've seen in the second wave. So we know that you've seen the Western world, Europe, and the United States and Japan and other areas or other nations, trying to conquer all these territories in Africa and Asia. So let's see how natives and locals across the world responded. So let's focus a little bit on the Americas. First off, North America and the United States. Those of you familiar with the United States history are familiar with the United States and their consistent pushing of Native Americans westward. One of the most infamous in American history would be the Indian Removal Act, which basically removes the Indian presence, Native American presence from, the eastern seaboard, initially settling them on reservations, particularly areas like Oklahoma. Not all natives are forced out. Some will actually work to, instead of trying to maintain their culture, some will try to assimilate more into the United States, more way of life from a American perspective. The Cherokee are known to do that, to assimilate, to develop into their own alphabet, and are one of the tribes that tend to Americanize and assimilate as best they can. Other tribes try to maintain their traditional ways of life, but are forced to do that on these really, really tiny reservations. Probably the last gasp of Native American resistance happens in the Midwest, pretty much from that, the plains areas basically is what we're talking about. And so what tends to happen is that you have, as the United States is continuing its expansion westward, they're slowly adding more American presence in these areas, and Native groups there are finally starting to get a lot more pressure from the Americans, and so they are now starting to resist. And probably the last opportunity for this is what's called the ghost dance ritual. So the ghost dance ritual, to make a long story short, was basically the idea that through this dance, through this gathering of natives together, particularly the Sioux are the ones that are probably most well known for this, that by doing this dance, it will help then to eradicate the presence of Americans from native lands, get rid of them, and kind of restore things back to what they had been. Now, by doing that ghost dance ritual, that was the goal. Of course, that's not really what actually happens. And in fact, the Plains Wars are really pretty bloody, and we'll deal with this a lot more in United States history. But make a long story short, the Battle of Wounded Knee, some people will call it a battle, some people will call it a massacre, depending on how you look at it, will effectively end Native American resistance, basically organized Native American resistance in the United States from a physical fighting standpoint. So that's North America. South America, another example that we can look at will be Tupac Amaru II's revolt in Peru. So Tupac Amaru was actually a descendant of the last Incan ruler. Now we know that the Spanish had come over and conquered the Incas in the early 1500s, and had continued, as we saw through colonization, to instill their practices, and we saw that in our last unit. In the 1780s, actually, Tupac Amaru changes his name to Tupac Amaru in honor of his the last official Incan emperor, and will in fact basically, and I'm sorry if I may have misspoke that, he's not the last Incan emperor, he's a descendant of the last Incan emperor, but he does lead a revolt against the Spanish, and it's a pretty gruesome one in how it all shakes out. He's actually captured. His family is executed before his eyes, before he's captured. But it's the last formal organized native resistance from an Incan's perspective against the Spanish in that Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina sections of South America along that seaboard. So there was native resistance in the Americas, and those are some examples that we could highlight. All right, let's shift gears and talk about Africa. We'll deal a lot more with Asia in our next chapter. So in Africa, we'll look at three different examples. The first off being Samari Touré's war in West Africa. So Samari Touré basically gets a group. He's a growing power in West Africa and establishes a small kingdom in Guinea. And through the mid 1700s, he is actually going to oppose French colonization of this area and fights quite handedly against them. He is eventually defeated and becomes his territories become incorporated into French territory, but he is a big thorn in the side of the French for quite some time. Some other responses. Let's look at South Africa. So we talked about South Africa from a British perspective as a settler colony. So one of the more interesting movements of this time frame was called the Xhosa cattle killing movement. And so essentially in South Africa, a lot of the natives had herds of cattle that were starting to die from some mysterious diseases. Some people think it's because of interaction with diseases from animals and cattle brought from Europe itself. Regardless, they take this as a sign that maybe if they continue to let their cattle die or kill them, that it will then rid their area of the British, of the Europeans. And so almost 500,000 cattle die, about 400,000. And as a result, what it actually does is cause a huge famine because, lack of foodstuffs available. And so it ends up killing thousands as a result of this. And does not, of course, as we know, basically the British aren't leaving after this, so it was failed in that result. Then we've also got other indigenous groups fighting against the Europeans in the South Africa region as well. And the South Africa region is a pretty big colony overall, and it'll delineate further. We'll look at that. But you have a group called the Zulu. The Zulu are known to be very fierce fighters. Pictured top right is what an artist representation of Shaka Zulu, is probably one of the most famous Zulu in history. And in the 1870s, the British are trying to, through Anglo-British, right? That's another word for it. Think Anglo-Saxon. They are fighting against the Zulus there in that South Africa region. And when the British defeat the Zulu, which is one of the more powerful tribes in that area, it really consolidates control for them. But the Zulu were known to be very fierce warriors and a tough opponent for the British in this area. And then let's shift at and look at what's happening in that Gold Coast, that lower West African region, and the Ya Asante-wa War. So this is the British. It happens in. This is probably the fifth, basically, of a series of wars there. What's so noteworthy about this fifth one is that it's actually led by the queen of this area, Ya Asante-wa. She was wife of the king who had actually been taken away by the British. And so we actually will hopefully get to look at some quotes from her, because she's going to rally then her population to fight against the British. And they will fight against them in that Ghana region. The Asante in general are the name of this this group. And they are, of course, as you saw, not successful in fighting off the British. That area becomes a part of what we know of as the British Gold Coast. Ghana becomes a territory of the British. So, but these are examples of how we saw in the Americas and in Africa resistance to European rule. So they love that as a test question. So just be prepared for that. And that's pretty much chapter 18. We're looking at European imperialism, a lot in Africa, a little bit in Asia, and we'll continue on in chapter 19, and that will finish up Unit 6. Thanks for watching.